With your kind permission, Olivia, I shall start now. Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, distinguished colleagues. On behalf of Ambassador Olivia Mais and myself, I'm very pleased to welcome you to the 4th virtual town hall briefing for stakeholders and UN agencies on the progress declaration of the International Migration Review Forum. Ben, our technical expert, has already provided you with some of the housekeeping rules, but I will again request you to please keep your microphones off when you're not speaking. Dear colleagues, I would like to thank everyone for your very constructive engagement in the process so far. At our last town hall briefing on the 6th of April, we provided you with an overview of the Rev 1 version of the document and received your comments and reflections on it. Today, Ambassador Mais and I will pick up from where we left off our discussions the last time. As you are aware, on the 12th of April, we circulated the Rev 2 version of the Zero Draft, and the Rev 2 document was prepared taking into consideration the written inputs from member states as well as the discussions during the informal meetings on the 7th and 8th of April. We also considered the key takeaways from the town hall meetings with you all on the 6th of April, as well as the written comments and suggestions that we have received from the different stakeholders. After the circulation of the Rev 2 document, we have held several informal rounds of consultations with all delegations at the experts level, facilitated by our experts, Nirupam and Julie. The primary objective of the informal discussions was to go through the Rev 2 document paragraph by paragraph to have more extensive discussions on some of the key issues in the text. We have completed the reading of the entire document just yesterday, which makes today's meeting extremely timely. We are now identifying those paragraphs that will require further work, and we intend to engage with delegations on those paragraphs issues that require further discussions with a view to narrowing down the gaps that remain. While there are still diverging views on a number of topics, we are extremely pleased to see the growing convergence around a number of important issues, which include the following, and this is not an exhaustive list. The need to further streamline the key tenets of the Global Compact throughout the text, the contributions of migrants and migration to development, on strengthening language on women, children, human rights, climate change, diaspora, and remittances, the importance of addressing racism, xenophobia, and violence against women migrant workers and migrants in general, and the challenges relating to trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants. Allow me to very briefly walk you through some of the key changes that we have made in the Rev 2 document without going into the details. I will outline the changes in section 1 and 2, and thereafter I'll hand over to Ambassador Mais to go through section 3 and explain the way forward. Dear colleagues, in the introductory section of the document, we further strengthened language on some important issues. In paragraph 7, for instance, we highlighted all aspects of the contribution of migrants to our societies. We also included 2 additional paragraphs in this section in response to the requests of delegations to address the issues of xenophobia, discrimination, as well as on trafficking and human smuggling. In section 2, we highlighted the challenges faced by migrants in accessing humanitarian assistance. We also strengthened language on the return and readmissions of migrants, the overall impact of mobility restrictions, child detention, the limited availability of pathways for regular migration, as well as the right to privacy. With those few words, I would now like to hand over to Ambassador Mais. Olivia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Fatima Diarabab. It's a pleasure to moderate this 4th town hall meeting with you, and also from my side, a very good morning or good afternoon in Europe to all the colleagues on this call. I will now briefly address the changes that we made to section 3 of the progress declaration in the version, the REF2, where you already described the changes we made to the first part of the text. Concerning the third section, we changed the title of the section to better reflect the points of view that we have heard from both member states and stakeholders, focusing on commitments and actions. And this is certainly an area where the discussions are ongoing and where we will strive to move the positions closer to an agreement. Given the comments made by a number of delegations and stakeholders, to ensure that we do not conflate the notions of human trafficking, trafficking in persons on one hand, and smuggling on the other hand, we have now added two separate standalone paragraphs on these issues in section 3. And throughout this final section, we also attempted to further bring the text in line with the Global Compact. And we believe that the commitments and actions included in the REF2 make the Progress Declaration ambitious yet realistic enough to enjoy broad support. That said, we of course welcome your views and suggestions today also on that part of the Progress Declaration. Please allow me to say a few brief words on the next steps before I open the floor for interactive discussions. This week on Friday, the 22nd of April, we intend to convene another informal to discuss a select number of paragraphs at expert level. And thereafter, we plan to hold another round of informal consultations early next week. We will announce the new date of the informal consultations shortly. And the objective of these informal consultations would be to discuss any unresolved issues and to address those paragraphs of the Progress Declaration which enjoy consensus. And based on the progress in the informal consultations early next week, we will then decide on our next course of action. Of course, we will keep you updated on the further development of our work, and we thank you again, all stakeholders, for your support, strong interest and constructive engagement throughout the process. Dear colleagues, I will now open the floor for comments and statements. All participants are reminded to kindly turn off their microphones when they are not speaking. And there is no established list of speakers. Those wishing to speak are advised to use the chat function to request the floor. We have already done this a number of times, so I trust that you know the system. Please type the name of your organization and indicate that you are requesting the floor. And in order to hear as many speakers as possible within the limited time available for this 2-hour meeting, we would kindly request you to limit your interventions to 3 minutes. And now I will give the floor to the first speaker on our list, Mrs. Carol Barton from the Women in Migration Network. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I first want to start by thanking both of you for your leadership and recognize that we're at the point where it gets complicated, and to wish you well in these negotiations. I guess first and foremost, we want to say that the Progress Declaration needs to reaffirm and seek to implement and strengthen the Global Compact. That should go without saying, but we think that that's essential to a successful IMRF. I want to speak specifically to gender issues this morning. We're concerned that there is little evidence in the document of an integrated gender approach, which situates the particular experiences of women and gender nonconforming migrants in the context of migration, including regarding to root causes of migration, labor rights, climate-related displacement, and the need for expanded rights-based regular pathways. There's a tendency in this document to see women migrants primarily in situations of vulnerability. We're happy to see references to gender-based violence, but if that's the only reference, then it tends to only equate all violence with gender-based violence. We see the lumping together of women and children without recognizing the leadership and agency of women. Migrant women, as I mentioned, is primarily, it comes up around gender-based violence, but not the full range of the experiences of women in migration. And we think that this falls short of the women's autonomy approach of the guiding principle on gender responsiveness. So to be specific, in paragraph 9, we really welcome the fact that there was reference to women migrant workers and that this may be expanded or has been expanded to labor rights of all workers. And we think that that should be a paragraph that addresses migrant workers in general. And in doing so, we really urge that freedom of association be included and that the reference to decent work and the human rights values enshrined in the ILO are referenced in that paragraph. But in that very welcome reference to labor rights, we now feel like what is lost is a paragraph on women migrants in general. When we refer only to migrant women workers, we lose the realities of other migrant women who are not specifically migrant workers. So we think that as there is a paragraph on migrant children and a paragraph on racism, there should also be a 9 bis perhaps paragraph on migrant women. And it could commit to accelerating efforts to ensure a rights-based, gender-responsive approach to migration, affirming respect for women's decision-making and their full, equal, effective, and meaningful participation, which is critical to achieving their safe, orderly, and regular migration. We've made other points in writing, and I know that my colleagues will echo them, so I will leave my references there. One last point is that there is ample language in Commission on the Status of Women and other documents recognizing women's sexual and reproductive health and rights. And we think that that's essential to women's resilience and adaptation and ability to claim their rights. And so we'd like to see language from other agreed language documents referenced in that regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Barton, for your comments and suggestions. I will now give the floor to Mrs. Eileen Sana from the Center for Migrant Advocacy Women Migrant Forum. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you, co-facilitators. I am Ellen Sana from the Center for Migrant Advocacy in the Philippines, and I also represent today the Migrant Women Forum, a network of organizations from the Global South based in and are from the MENA, Asia, and the Pacific region. Amidst the pandemic in 2021, migrant workers remitted $751 billion to their countries of origin as they continue performing services as frontliners and essential workers in countries of destination, if only to guarantee that essential goods and services are delivered unhampered within and across borders. They comprise 4.9% of global labor force, or as high as 41.4% in the Arab states. They work round the clock, earning on average 12.6% less wages compared to nationals. They live in cramped accommodations. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated this deplorable living and working conditions, foremost of which is the exclusion of many migrant workers in low-wage occupations, especially. Most of them are women migrants and also the undocumented ones from social protection programs that cover immediate needs like access to healthcare and basic services, unemployment benefits, and more so to cover their retirement and old age to cover for their retirement and old age so they can live a life of dignity just like any other workers. As workers are mobile, moving across borders, so must decent work conditions, including social protection, be portable with concerned duty bearers ensuring that this is so. In this light, we propose that reference to social protection be made more visible and strong in the declaration. Specifically in paragraph 31B, we suggest to add the word effective to describe access to unemployment benefits and adequate social protection, and add and portability of earned benefits. We welcome Malaysia's recent initiative to include migrant domestic workers in their social security programs. And finally, under paragraph 38, we reiterate the policy of inclusion, and we suggest to further qualify safe access by inserting and effective access to, and insert social protection and portability of earned benefits. And then we continue with the statement. Looking forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Sana, for your contribution and very specific suggestions for the progress declaration. Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Mrs. Carolina Gotardo, representing the International Detention Coalition. Mrs. Gotardo, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Ambassador, and hello to everyone. Firstly, thank you so much to you and to Ambassador Fatima and your teams for all the work that you have done to produce this draft, which as we will mention, we're very pleased with some of the language on parts on detention. I'm speaking on behalf of the International Detention Coalition. We're a coalition of 400 plus members working towards ending immigration detention and promoting alternatives to detention. And we engage at regional and national levels with the states on GCM implementation. And we are one of the colleagues of the UN Network on Migration Working Group on Alternatives to Detention with UNHCR and Unicef. So as I was saying, with regards to the Rev 2, we specifically welcome the new language in paragraph 26 on ending child detention, and this never being in the best interest of the child. This is in line with Objective 13 of the GCM and its actional commitments, and also with the guiding principles of the GCM, particularly regarding child sensitivity and human rights. And it also reflects some of the progress made by states on GCM implementation to protect the best interests of the child by taking those steps to end child immigration detention. We encourage the co-facilitators to keep this language as requested by some member states and to avoid any attempts of weakening language on this. We, however, have some concerns with an addition on the following paragraph 27, and this is the addition of the word some before policies, practices, and conditions associated with immigration detention to the last sentence on this paragraph, because this seems to imply that detention sometimes does not affect migrants. But there is plenty of evidence showing that detention always affects migrants and has devastating effects on their health and well-being. So, for instance, some language could be arbitrary deprivation of liberty, overcrowding, and poor access to services in detention worsens the physical and mental health and well-being of migrants. An alternative, and as a minimum, we will strongly suggest removing the added word some from paragraph 27. We were also very pleased to see the new language under paragraph 42 bis, as it sets the ground for a concrete deliverable in the progress declaration. And to strengthen this language in a quite practical way, we suggest to include a minor reference to peer learning as follows. So for instance, we will evaluate through appropriate mechanisms, including through peer learning, progress and challenges in working to end the practice of child detention in the context of international migration with a view to expanding alternatives. And this minor inclusion will acknowledge the collaboration efforts taken by member states and the UN network and civil society and other stakeholders through the working groups of the network and at national, regional, and global level, making a clear reference to a very specific methodology which has been tested successfully and provides an example of a practical way to look into progress, gaps, challenges, and opportunities. And also it enhances what the Secretary General report on GCM implementation says, that includes references to peer learning efforts to advance the GCM implementation. I also want to back the comments made by my colleague Carol Barton from Women in Migration Network before, in terms of gender and in terms of expanding the issue of what violence against women mean and not putting together the issue of women and children. And finally, we hope to see a progress declaration with no regressions from the GCM that fully upholds GCM guiding principles and suggests these practical ways forward to deliver them that you were talking about before. That includes concrete ways to expanding communities, rights-based and community centers alternatives to detention, as solidifies these opportunities for the whole of society approach and whole of government approaches through peer learning, and acknowledges the role of migrant communities, including leaders with lived experience, ensuring their full participation in a meaningful and not tokenistic ways, and building on these steps that have already been taken by states and stakeholders over the past 4 years, and pave ways to ending child immigration detention as an initial step towards ending immigration detention for all. So thank you again, and thank you for organizing these meetings as well.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Gotardo, for your suggestions and contribution and engagement in this process. I will now give the floor to Mrs. Michelle Levoy, Platform for the International Cooperation on Undocumented Migrants. And just a reminder to please keep within the 3 minutes so that we can hear all who want to intervene today. Mrs. Levoy, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, co-facilitators, once again for your leadership and for convening us. So we fully support Carol Barton's intervention on behalf of women on the gender aspects, and also Catalina's intervention just now on detention. We definitely are also very much supporting this, the paragraph 26, ending detention in line with international law. Paragraph 42 bis, and also with the new mechanism that you're proposing, and also with IDC's suggestion on tweaking. But we're also very aware from those from civil society who've been listening to member states that some member states are pushing back on this. And we think it's good to recall where we are in 2022 on this. Since 2018, on 4 separate occasions, the 700 plus members of the European Parliament have called on 4 separate times to end detention of children. So we have pressure actually that's coming from member states, but in different ways, from elected members of parliament. So we need to be aware of that when you might be hearing demands actually to change the wording that is now actually quite progressive. We also definitely agree with IDC's proposal in paragraph 27 about shortening that sentence. Detention is actually seen as a punishment within migration management rather than a policy tool. And we have decades of research on this. So we actually suggest slightly altering that paragraph 27. The third point I want to make is on children. On paragraph 42 bis, it's been actually quite encouraging to see references to children, actions concerning children, all that should stay in. We actually have a further suggestion to strengthen it, to talk about migration procedures that would be founded on the best interests of the child. It's also important that you've put in regardless of status in that paragraph. But we were wondering what you actually see as pushback to talking about children with their families more specifically, because it's really mentioned here unaccompanied and separate. But we know from experience in Europe that children who are undocumented, who are with their families, actually have fewer protections than children who are unaccompanied or separated. Just as an example, there's 9 EU member states that have legislation for healthcare for undocumented children who are with their families, that's equal to citizen children. So that's obviously promising, but that means that in 2/3 of EU member states, undocumented children who are with their parents do not have the same access to healthcare. And sometimes it's actually very restrictive. So we really encourage you to be more visible about undocumented children with their parents. The fourth point is on regardless of status. We have heard also from the discussions that some member states are proposing to take that out all throughout the text. we also think here it's good to recall the reality. So once again, in Europe, there's Belgium, Italy, France, each have almost 30 years of experience in legislating on access to healthcare regardless of status. In Norway, the law on communicable diseases shows that everyone, regardless of residence status, has access to healthcare regardless of related to communicable diseases. And last year, the Directorate of Health in Norway published guidance so that undocumented could get access to the COVID vaccine. But it's also good to know that the United States itself, almost 30 years ago to the day, in the US Supreme Court, Plyler versus Doe, ruled that undocumented children should have access to free compulsory education. So basically what we suggest on regardless of status is that the Progress Declaration is recognition of the reality and decades of experience that member states have in legislating and in giving practice on issues such as healthcare, regularization, etc. The last 2 points, return. On paragraph 43 quat, we suggest shortening it and to add some wording to guarantee due process, individual assessment, and effective remedy in return to strengthen the human rights references. On smuggling, paragraph 28, we find that the new wording is actually quite good, and we would suggest that it stays that way because there's a need to include the element of financial and material benefit, not to criminalize humanitarian assistance and not only life-saving acts, and not to criminalize migrants themselves and to promote regular pathways. All that's good. And just lastly, on racism, excellent that you've strengthened it further. We would, and I think Stella from Afford will be saying this later, on 12 bis, we suggest strengthening by including a reference to systemic racism and also racism in the context of migration governance. Also in line with the reality that we're in 2022 and being recognizant that we have to be more open and more objective about a lot of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Levoy, for your comments and suggestions. I will now give the floor to Sumita Krishna, representing our Journey Malaysia Lawyers Beyond Borders, before handing the floor to Ambassador Fatima. Madam Krishna, you have the floor.
Thank you. I would like to refer to paragraph 24, where it begins the last sentence, migration procedures often lack predictability. I would like to suggest after to due process to include the words and access to justice in both pre and post return. Due process is the legal requirement that the state must respect the legal rights owed to a person, but access to justice is a wider definition that encompasses the right to an effective remedy, includes but not limited to the guarantees of access to affordable legal representation, which may also include a state pro bono legal aid system. So it's also important to include the words pre and post return, because in many instances, when the migrant is deported or forcibly returned to the country of origin, he often loses the right to pursue legal remedy in the country of destination, especially in labor cases where the migrant's presence is required. The migrant is unable to return to the country of destination to pursue legal remedy, not because the law does not allow, but because the immigration requirements that makes it difficult for the migrant to obtain the necessary documentation to return. So we propose that the sentence that end access to justice in and both pre and post return will address the situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Krishna, for your suggestion and also keeping with the time. I'll now hand the floor back to you, dear Rabab, for the next interventions. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Olivia. Thank you. And I would like to again thank every one of you for your extremely important and useful contribution. Throughout the process, you have been providing us with extremely useful language, reflections, recommendations, and you will see that many of them have actually found their place in the draft that is before us. We are also noting the very specific comments that are being made in the chat box, and please do share your language and proposals also with us in writing, and we'll certainly take them on board and consider them. Let me now go over the next list of speakers, and my appeal again would be I will join Ambassador Olivia to say that let's try to keep within the time limit so that we can have as many speakers as possible. I would now like to call upon Sumaya Islam from the Bangladesh Women Workers Center. Sumaya, you have the floor.
Assalamu alaikum, very good morning and afternoon. This is Sumaya from BNSK, Bangladesh. Thank you so much, madam, to give a chance. Just I'd like to talk on the two objectives, 14 and 15, for access to service. And if you see the paragraph 31, the support service in consular service for migrant workers. And madam, what type of problem women migrant workers, they are especially facing in country of origin and country of destination. And madam, that what the contribution, economic contribution to our migrant workers. So we need to focus more supportive consular service. Already here's a one-stop shop, but how we can make it more effective support service mechanism, strengthening support service mechanism, country of origin and country of destination. At the same time, we have seen that women and children in the same line, but how we can separate it, women focus, because the women workers, what they are facing in as a Gulf country, as a domestic workers, even in the garment sector. So we need to separate for the women workers issue as a gender perspective, and freedom of movement and freedom of work. This is very important, and I believe you are there. So we believe that we can keep this on track so that women can get their access to justice, access to service in both countries. And there should be a happily return and reintegration in the society, exclusive reintegration in the society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sumaya, for also being staying within the time limit. And I'm very happy to see that the large number of voices speaking out in favor of for the women migrants and women migrant workers. Thank you. I would now like to give the floor to Shakirul Islam from the Migrant Rights Network. Shakirul Islam, you have the floor.
Thank you, Excellencies Co-Facilitator Rabab Fatima, Madam, dignitaries, the civil society leaders. Good evening from my part of the world. I am representing a grassroots migrant organization in Bangladesh named Ohibashi Kurmi Unnayan Program. I thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I have 3 specific recommendations, but before saying that, I support what my sister Ellen said because she spoke for a lot of our people. My recommendations, number 1, we appreciate that the Progress Declaration para 21 has mentioned the progress made in relation to climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies and policies. The existing strategies and policies highlight that the states have primary duty to protect those who are displaced and migrate. However, we must recommend that the state should critically consider prevention and avoid conditions that might lead to displacement and migration in a way that ensure that the physical, cultural, psychological loss and damage and struggles of individuals, children, and women are duly recognized by enforcing community-led interventions, by putting the funds committed by the international leaders. Second, we ask the member states to work with the migrants organizations and the civil societies and their networks to streamline and develop an appropriate strategy for extended implementation in the next phase of the GCM. My third point is that we must acknowledge the civil unrest that could be caused by climate-induced internal migration. Therefore, we recommend a mission to examine the evidence, incidence, and prevalence, particularly in the Asian region. In relation to my recommendations, I must mention that there is increasing evidence that climate change is a driver of migration. Migration itself is not considered an adaptive response, rather it is a means of adaptation when a livelihood is insufficient to provide for the needs of the family due to extreme weather events like slow onset and sudden onset. We have many examples in Bangladesh. Our recent studies show that 82% of the coastal population in Bangladesh have at least one family member who migrates for livelihoods. Having failed to secure livelihoods, people are just forced to migrate elsewhere. Our experiences say that over the years, internal and seasonal migration due to environmental reasons has become the only and one of the least bad options for coping. Other studies estimated that by 2050, 1 in every 7 people in Bangladesh will be displaced by climate change, especially with a projected 50 centimeter rise in sea level. Bangladesh stands to lose 11% of its land, and up to 18 million people will be forced to migrate. But this is not only the case of Bangladesh. Many other countries around the world, especially in the Asian region, are encountering the same difficulties and challenges. Therefore, the state must delineate concrete actions to address climate-induced migration. I end here. Thank you very much, Madam, for being with us for this moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shakirul, for your important comments. And if I may also, before giving the floor to the next speaker, if I may also suggest at this point of time, it'll be very useful for us if you actually give specific language proposals on the existing text. All right, thank you. I would now like to give the floor to Dr. Lizzie Joseph of the National Workers' Welfare Trust. Dr. Joseph, you have the floor.
Good evening, ma'am. I'm very happy to have given this opportunity. I have suggestion for 2 paragraphs. That is paragraph number 36. I affirm that the practice of ensuring migrant workers access to healthcare, extending visas and for affordable healthcare, it's not only at times of pandemic. I am also calling upon you to ensure that the same dignity, respect, and access to healthcare be affordable at all times to all migrant workers, regardless of their migration status, at all times. Madam, secondly, I would like also to bring to your notice from the paragraph number 38. We appreciate that some countries like Bangladesh, Nepal have made efforts to engage an inclusive dialogue and promote meaningful participation of migrants and the organization that represent them in policy process on issues affecting migrants. It's our plea that the UN also urge all member states to do the same. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you very much, Madam, for your very specific proposals. And our earnest sort of request to you would be to mobilize a similar sort of support within with your national governments at the national level. Thank you very much. While we, of course, have been supporting more inclusive consultations with all stakeholders, and that is the purpose of having this meeting here today also. Thank you. I would now like to give the floor to Ms. Stella Opuku Owusu from the Africa Foundation for Development. Madam, you have the floor.
Great, thank you very much, Ambassador, and thanks to both you and your co-facilitator for the leadership and for the discussions on the REC 2. I'd like to focus just very specifically on language as it relates to diaspora and to racism, but also really to say that we welcome the additional references in relation to racism and also in relation to diaspora communities, especially in paragraph 36. In relation to paragraph 32, we welcome, of course, the paragraph in terms of the progress that has been highlighted as it relates to diaspora humanitarian efforts. But we also feel that the paragraph in general could be strengthened much more by making a reference to where a little bit more improvements could be made. Because at the moment, in as much as there are a couple of references or 3 to diaspora and diaspora communities in the documents, there isn't very much of a focus as to where a little bit more improvement could be made. And so the suggestion that we've made within paragraph 32 is just before the last line, that there is an inclusion that says that there was small progress in converting small-scale diaspora initiatives into structured programs, which could be accelerated by member states and other actors. We've also suggested that an additional economic initiatives is added to the line which references humanitarian initiatives to show the impact that the diaspora have also made on economic initiatives and economic impact in countries of origin. The second point on diaspora relates to paragraph 34, which talks about remittances and some of the progress that has been made. And we also thought that given that the African Union's legacy project, which is the African Diaspora Finance Corporation, has only recently also been recently been endorsed by African heads of government, that it's important that this is also recognized as it's a regional program, which could also encourage initiatives like these in other regions as well. So again, we've suggested another line within paragraph 34, just before the last line, that says scalable structures such as the African Union's legacy project, the ADFC, should be explored for leveraging remittances for sustainable development. On racism specifically, I would like to turn to paragraph 12b and also support Michelle Levoy's points relating to this. And again, we welcome this new paragraph as well and would suggest that it is strengthened by including another reference to systemic racism so that it's also consistent with paragraph 40. In addition, we would also like to implore that there is a reconsideration for including the link between systemic racism and migration governance. We've had recent examples of this, as we've seen on the Ukrainian borders. I would like to implore that this is also reconsidered and that a line is included in there which says against migrants, as it is at the moment, and diaspora, because the diaspora also face this issue, including in the context of migration governance. And then finally, in paragraph 40, we also have included and have suggested we've made some suggestions in there which relate to reviewing some of the legislations and policies as it relates to racism and systemic racism and so forth. And this is a point that will also, I believe, will be made by the Quakers as well. And we've also suggested another addition there in relation to migration governance, talking about the manifestation of systemic racism in migration governance alongside all forms of racial discrimination. And once again, we've also suggested another inclusion of diaspora communities in the last sentence that refers to migrants, so that it says that the role of migrants and diaspora communities as agents of sustainable development. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam, for your very useful and specific language proposals. And it is also very good to see that all of you are coordinating amongst yourselves on the submissions to be made. I would now like to give the floor to Mr. Apollina Tolentino from the Building and Woodworkers International before I hand over to Ambassador Mays. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you so much, ambassadors, for the great effort you have done to this process. We acknowledge the continuing developments progress of the current declaration version, particularly keeping the reference to wage theft. But at the same time, we believe that the sections, particularly on migrant workers' rights, can be strengthened. And we have several particular recommendations on the text. We would like to have a new paragraph 39 ter, to read as: we recommend the use of social dialogue at the national level to engage unions and worker organizations and employers in the development of labor migration policy and in promoting ILO core labor standards and access to justice for workplace violations for all migrant workers, regardless of their status. On paragraph 43, the original one, we would like to add, in line with the core international labor standards after the concluding labor mobility agreements, as well as add justice and after, and access to in the last sentence. And we will have to have new entire additional sentence to this section to read as: we commit to the development of justice mechanisms that allow migrant workers, whether still in the destination country, destination and return, or a third country, to easily and fairly obtain remedies for the systematic violations that migrant workers face in the workplace in destination countries, especially wage theft, confirming the principle of portable justice, and supporting the ILO to use its tripartite mechanism to develop international standards around remedying wage theft and other workplace violations for migrants. And finally, on paragraph 45, we would like to start with: we recognize the value and dignity of all work. Also add: through social dialogue, after the mutual recognition of formal and informal skills and competencies acquired by migrants. Add: earned wages after the recovery of, and also add: and justice mechanisms after social protection and services. And finally, add a final sentence to read: we commit to supporting the freedom of association, right to self-collective bargaining for all migrants in the workplace, regardless of their status. This is our submission, ambassadors. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your very specific proposals, Mr. Tolentino, and we'll request you to please send those in writing. We have just posted the email addresses again, where to send them. Thank you. I would now like to hand over to Ambassador Mays.
Thank you very much, Rabab, and thanks again to all for the very useful contributions. And let me also draw your attention to the email addresses and network hub address that was posted in the chat. Please transmit your concrete language suggestions that will, through these addresses, that will greatly facilitate our work. I will now give the floor to Mr. Samuel Boutruche, representing UNHCR. Mr. Boutruche, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Mace, and thank you also to Ambassador Fatima for your leadership, for also the inclusive process of these consultations, and taking the time to make your utmost to take into account our comments. I'll be very quick, just two suggestions for your consideration. I will post specific wording in a message to the email address you just mentioned. We were wondering if there was any room to include a paragraph to recognize the distinction between refugees and migrants along the lines of the clarification contained in paragraph 4 of the GCM. The reason for that is, of course, that we've witnessed a number of confusions, and in particular in the context of the regional reviews, a number of achievements in relation to asylum and refugee activities were reported as achievements in terms of GCM implementation, which I think is of course welcome, but belongs to of course another framework, which is the GCR. And in this respect, we were wondering if actually this distinction and the fact that they are governed by two separate compacts, and that these two compacts should be applied in a consistent way, could help states indeed to make linkages between the two compacts. The second suggestion relates to paragraph 28, to try to strengthen the paragraph with a reference to the concerns regarding the lack of disembarkation arrangements for migrants moving by sea. This is reflecting a very strong recommendation in the SG report, and we were hoping this could also find its place in the progress declaration. But thank you very much for all your efforts, and really commending your work on this very important task. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Butrush, for your suggestions and for sending them also in writing to the addresses of our experts also. I now give the floor to Mr. Werner Obermeier, representing the World Health Organization. Mr. Obermeier, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Myers and Ambassador Fatima, for your leadership in this important process. We are very grateful for all the references to health which are throughout the text. We wanted to intervene to highlight a couple of areas where some technical accuracies could perhaps be improved. And these refer to the various terminologies around access to health, which is a fundamental human right, basic human right. So wherever there is a reference to basic services, it's important to reflect health services. Health services is the terminology used by WHO, and in fact in all the political declarations adopted by the General Assembly at the heads of state level, when it refers to services that serve families, communities, and populations, that protect and promote health, and that encompass the wide range of services which include promotion, prevention, treatment, diagnostics, palliation, palliative care, and rehabilitation. In contrast, using terms such as healthcare is a much narrower definition, because the healthcare refers to care provided mainly by health professionals and consists of primary care, for example. This is the doctor that treats people at first point of contact. Secondary care, which are specialists that provide care, and then obviously tertiary care is the equipment used for specialized care. So the definition is much narrower. So we wanted to highlight this when we talk about the recovery post-COVID and also supporting people that have been affected by the pandemic. It's once again important to mention that there must be an investment in strengthening resilient health systems which provide health services, the full spectrum of health services, and narrower definitions would exclude the promotion side, rehabilitation side, palliative care, and diagnostics in many cases, because treating patients with COVID-19 does not only include provision of vaccines, but diagnostics, post-care treatment as well, and of course, testing. So we will work with you and send these comments as we have before in writing, and hope that you will take this into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Obermeier, for bringing in WHO's expertise on health terminology. That is much appreciated, and we will, of course, take it into account as we move forward. I will now give the floor to Chandra Shekhar, representing the International Trade Union Confederation of India. Madam or sir, you have the floor.
Yeah, brother, thank you for giving me the opportunity. On the trade union perspective, I say that providing a recognized and magnitude of role of the migrant workers and their problems and vulnerabilities, and the role of responsibilities of various stakeholders in addressing these issues. And the sound policy viewed in the document should be on the human rights and the property rights, economic and social development, and foreign policy lens. And it should also reinstate that the rights-based and labor rights perspective built around the core issues of dignity of labor, around the core issues of ILO commitment and the sustainable development goals of particularly the SDG 8.8 on the protection of labor rights and providing a safe and secure environment for the migrant workers. And this is my perspective of migrant workers. Thanks for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shekhar, for your contribution. We have taken note. I will now give the floor to Mr. Vladimir Pascual-Revello, representing the association Rumina UI. Mr. Revello, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, embajadora.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Ambassadors, I should say, of Bangladesh and Luxembourg. Thank you for coordinating today's roundtable. So I'm speaking on behalf of our organization and the Migrants Network in Spain and the Latin American bloc. I just wanted to highlight what the previous colleagues have said, that this is basically a declaration where we don't necessarily talk about the rights, and I'd like to add to what Senor Mr. Wicombe and other colleagues have said. And in that line, I'd like to go back to number 6, where we only talk about development, and other paragraphs as well, where we could also say that us as migrants, we also undertake co-development. That's to say that we work together with our countries so that our countries develop also. And I think that as regards number 7, we are seen as migrants in terms of our remittances only helping our family members. No, they also take social pressure off of our countries of origin. They give it liquidity, etc., etc. And all of those additional benefits don't appear in any of the current drafting and have to be reflected. And I think that in COVID-19, we've been essential in agriculture, in healthcare, and in transport, etc., etc., etc. And I'd like to just add to the colleagues that spoke about wage theft, and that situation should be upheld. We have to have dignified salaries. We have to be paid in conformity with the law, and we have to pay people and get the same wages as locals. And I think that we have to talk about the digital gap that a lot of migrants suffer from, which often is really quite large, and it means that we are not able to access public administration. And I think we'd also like to comment on paragraph 38 about inclusion, integration, and also the political rights of migrants. We have the right to take part in political life in our countries as well, and in the countries of destination as well. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Pascual-Revello, for your intervention. We've taken notes of your suggestions.
Mrs. Sonia George, representing Self-Employed Women's Association, joining us from India, if I understand correctly.
Thank you.
Madam, you have the floor.
Yeah. Thank you, Ambassador. I would like to raise the issue again of women workers in the document, and it is noticeable that many suggestions have come up with regard to women migrants, and the declaration expresses, especially when you talk about the objective number 1, collect and utilize accurate and disaggregated data as a basis for evidence-based practices. In number 37 of the declaration, as you have rightly pointed out, gaps in data collection and analysis persist. And as most of us know that multiple and intersectional forms of such structural discrimination forces many women migrant workers to migrate through invisible and unrecognized channels and pathways. And for this, I think it is important that, again, we have to look at the governments who impose age bans and deployment bans, and this provides more and more chances of this undocumented migration. So one of the first suggestions that I would like to make is in number 37, gaps in data collection and analysis persist when you go through the text, considering migration, sex, age, race, ethnicity, migration status, disability, geographical location, and other characteristics relevant in national context. We have to include in the text the non-recorded data of irregular migrants, especially women, should be included in the text. And the second one is with regard to, it has been, Brother Dong has strongly raised the issue of issue of the including the perspective of labor in the document. So again, I would like to point out to number 42 that when you think about national gender responsive and child sensitive migration policies, I think we have to think about international and national laws in the text. We have to consider that, and also protect and fulfill the human and labor rights, especially of migrant women workers. That is very important in this context, because many times there is a tendency to consider women as part of the women development policies and not being considered them as equal participant in the labor force. So that is very important for us to include. And one more thing that I would like to propose is, in the rehabilitation policies, when you talk about paragraph 43, in 43 in the third addition that we have made, we should have returning migrants should be assisted in their sustainable and gender responsive reintegration processes. So, and also when you talk about 43 again, gender discrimination, especially gender-based violence, is mentioned here very specifically. But I think it will be helpful to include, as the labor standards was mentioned in the paragraph. It's important to consider C190 as it is one of the most significant international labor standards that have been adopted recently. And if you try to include C190 in this paragraph, it will give more specific orientation and more specific international labor standard support to this document. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Seva, for your contribution. We have taken very good note of that. I will now hand the floor back to you, dear Rabab, for our next speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Olivia. Thank you. And this is extremely useful and particularly heartening to see such strong participation from all regions of the world. Thank you. I would now like to give the floor to Ms. Melanie Teff from Unicef. You have the floor, madam.
Thank you very much. First of all, I wanted to thank you very much and congratulate you for the very much strengthened text on children in the Progress Declaration. UNICEF is very pleased to see this strengthened text. To make things quicker, first of all, I will simply support the points made by Michelle of PICUM and by Carolina of IDC about children in the current text, and the importance of retaining the language on regardless of status throughout the text, and on child immigration detention. Just wanted to make 3 points about elements relating to children that we think should be strengthened in the text, and of course I will submit in writing to you. One is about child and youth participation. We do think that it's important to have some recognition of children's participation in processes concerning them, which by extension means that child-friendly information is provided to children. We would suggest that in paragraph 9 ter, language such as "we recognise children as rights holders regardless of their migration status, including their right to be heard, and also recognise the importance of fostering the meaningful and inclusive participation of children and youth in migration policies and processes that concern them." On access to services, paragraph 38, we think it's really important to have reference not just to healthcare, but also particularly to education. And we would suggest adding, and by ensuring that all migrant children can access child protection, education, and social protection. And we propose adding also to this paragraph, without risk of arrest, deportation, and detention. That language is used already in paragraph 31 bis, and we think it should be added into paragraph 38 as well. And lastly, today, to mention statelessness. We're glad to see that mentioned in the document, but think that in paragraph 44, it would be helpful to add, and ensuring that all children are registered at birth to prevent statelessness or have access to statelessness determination procedures. We will submit in writing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Teff, for your specific proposals, and thank you once again for your very important contribution to this process. I would now like to give the floor to Ms. Miriam Inasha from the Public Interest Law Center. I believe it's from the Maldives. You have the floor, Madam. We can't hear you, Ms. Inasha. You may have to unmute yourself.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Please continue.
Okay. Hello. Yeah, my name is Maria Minasha. I'm from Maldives, and I'm from Public Interest Law Center, which is an organization which provides legal aid to vulnerable groups, including migrant workers. My recommendation is for paragraph 21. In paragraph 21, towards the end of the second sentence, I suggest to delete the part in line with national legislation. Further, to add at the end of the sentence, which read, however, the availability and flexibility of pathways for regular migration remains limited, and further to add to that sentence, due to discriminatory national legislations and practices. The reason for the recommendation is because it's important to note the barriers for flexibility of pathways, like language barriers, lack of awareness, and other factors like financial challenges. And in the Maldives, there are many migrant workers from different countries like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal. And as I work in an NGO which provides legal aid to these people, I have come across various migrants who wants to be regularized but have barriers to reach it due to various factors. Furthermore, even we as CSOs, we find it difficult to provide for these migrant workers because they have barriers to reach out to us as CSOs for help. Another suggestion is for paragraph 43, second sentence. I recommend to add to the sentence which read, while upholding the right to family life and to add to the sentence, and integrating progressive regularization processes of states due to COVID-19 into long-term mechanism to regularize migrants in an irregular situation. I suggest this recommendation because the policies introduced in COVID-19 are very progressive, and some were proposed by the civil society organizations even before COVID-19, and hence these progressive policies need to be put into long-term mechanism to ensure that rights of migrants are secured. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Ms. Inasha, for your useful recommendations, and we'll appreciate if you can send those in writing. I would now like to give the floor to Mr. Juan Carlos Viloria of the Federation Coalition for Venezuela. Mr. Viloria, you have the floor, sir. Mr. Juan Carlos Viloria from Venezuela, are you here with us? Let me move on to the next speaker, and I can come back to Mr. Viloria again. Let me now call upon Stephanie Jacquemet from the International Catholic Migration Commission. We can come back to Mr. Viloria later.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you for for the real dialogue that you have been opening up with us. This is really appreciated. I think one of the concerns that we have as civil society is that it seems that you have in the room a few delegations which not only would like to see, let's say, more prudent language, to have, let's say, less ambitious language, but would also take advantage of the Progress Declaration to revisit the commitments of the Global Compact on migration. So this is really a fear that we have. We are not talking about many delegations, just a few, but it could be sufficient to really weaken the text. So one of our plea to you and your team, and we know that it's massive work, is really to make a comparison word by word of each paragraph between the Global Compact, the text of the Global Compact, with the paragraphs in the draft declaration. I'm not going to go through all the document, but maybe we'll just give you one example. If we take paragraph 43 of the draft declaration dedicated to pathways, to regular pathways and promoting them, in the last version, it has been added in line with national legislation, which in fact is a weakening of the language and of the commitment, and it basically limits any initiative to whatever governments would like to do. So at least there is a risk of having that interpretation. So we would indeed like this reference to national legislation not to be there, but if it has to remain, we would suggest that instead of saying in line with, to say, for example, taking into account or acknowledging the relevance of national legislation. It's a nuance, but it can really open a number of doors for a more human rights approach to the and a principled approach to the GCM. I will send you my comments in writing. Thank you, Madam Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jacmet, for your usual very useful comments. Thank you very much. We have taken good note of that. And again, the whole purpose of having this town hall briefing is to engage with all stakeholders. And I think you also have a role to play at your national levels to mobilize the right opinion with your national authorities. Thank you very much. Has Mr. Viloria joined us? He has not, so let me move on to the next speaker, Ms. Marisa Leon Gomez-Sonnet from the Quaker UN office. Ms. Sonnet, you have the floor.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you, Ambassador. We appreciated hearing an updated timeline, and we ask that you kindly keep us updated on the time. I appreciate that it is tricky, but helpful for those of us following and seeking to support the process as best as possible. Overall, while we would like to see the progress declaration adopted by consensus, we're not sure if that is possible. We appreciate that some of those member states that did not support the GCM are engaging constructively, but we also see that others are engaging destructively, and there are those that we have not heard from at all. We would prefer consensus, but not at the expense of a meaningful declaration that builds in the GCM and contains some actions. And then I will just give some inputs on specific issues, but we are sending written inputs to the experts who are leading the process. First of all, on meaningful migrant participation, ideally, we would like to see the text on Rep 2 build on, but we understand that compromise may be necessary. We would like to see the reference to meaningful participation retained and the references to policy retained as well, to be clear that this is not just about participation in society in general, but specifically about participation in and contribution to informing policy. We hope that this will be a thread that runs throughout the IMRF, including the roundtables and policy debate, so that it will help us advance meaningful migrant participation post-IMRF. In terms of disembarkation, again, we will send language on this, but ideally we would like to see stronger and more urgent action on prevention of deaths in transit and migrants going missing. We welcome that you have held onto the language in paragraph 55 until now. We would like to see the explicit reference on disembarkation retained. This is needed to cover a specific protection gap that can and tragically does arise between rescue and arrival, and is sadly not as specific to one route or region. Finally, on women migrants, we echo Women in Migration Network, and that we share concerns as well raised by some delegations about the level of attention to women migrants. We think that edits to broaden the scope of paragraph 9 bis means that there is no longer a paragraph specifically focused on a woman in Section 1, and we think that a standalone paragraph is needed on this to close this gap. Again, we will send suggested wording and have been in contact with some of the relevant delegations. And just one final point that we echoed of Ford's and Pickham's statements on racism in regard to systemic racism and its direct connection to immigration governance. We also wish to see this one's retained and strengthened if possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sonnet, for your useful recommendations. And I thank actually Quaker UN Office for their very active participation throughout this process. Is Mr. Viloria with us now? Have we found him? I think we may have lost him. Let me call upon the next speaker before handing over to Ambassador Olivia Miles. I would like to call upon Mr. Ranjan Kurian from the Helvetus. Mr. Ranjan Kurian, are you with us? Yes, you are with us. Thank you. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. This is Ranjan Kurian representing Solidarity Center, Sri Lanka. I would like to propose social unrest in paragraph 43. So the sentence goes as climatic change and environment degradation, including social unrest. I believe migrant workers also fall into vulnerable situations, not only natural disasters, but also man-made disaster situations. Social, political, and economical issues of a country can also lead to social unrest. This is the reason why I think efforts to enhance and diversify pathways also consider situation like social unrest. Thank you, Madam Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kurian, for your very specific proposal. I would now like to hand over to my dear co-chair, co-facilitator, Ambassador Olivia Miles. Olivia, over to you.
Thank you very much, dear Rabab. I will now call on Mrs. Gilles Goldenseal, representing the Academic Council of the UN system. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Gilles Goldenseal from the Academic Council in the UN system. My views expressed are my own and do not represent those of all members of ACUNS, all academics, or the US government. I wanted to, first of all, echo Mr. Giacomet's concerns about watering down and revisiting the commitments made in the Global Compact, and also support the statements made by Michelle Lavoie of PICUM, Sonia George of SEWA, and Ms. Sonnet as well, who just spoke on improving the rights-based language in the document. I have made and will make further specific language proposals in writing. But as a general matter, I wanted to say that the Progress Declaration will be strengthened by including the language of and also reference and citations to international law. It is, although I recognize, of course, that the Progress Declaration, like the Global Compact itself, is not binding, the Global Compact is meant to be, and is stated to be in the document itself, implemented in accordance with and in support of the international law. And at a time when actors within the international system and within the UN system have been seeking to undermine the protections of international law in favor of development and often group rights, emphasizing international law and individual human rights is international human rights law and individual human rights. Protections accorded to individuals and individual migrants is especially important in the document. I submit comments on a number of paragraphs, but in particular here, I wanted to call attention to paragraphs 43 bis and ter, the new paragraphs which deal with human trafficking and smuggling. These paragraphs would be strengthened by explicit reference to the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime and promoting compliance with it where relevant, in addition to the excellent references to promoting bilateral and regional agreements. I will submit further comments in writing and keep it there for now. I appreciate the revisions to the draft and the attention of the co-facilitators to the voices of stakeholders and migrants in this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Goldenstiel. And indeed, the voice of all the stakeholders is very important to us, and we are really thankful for all the very useful contributions that have been made throughout the process, including today. And we look forward to continuing to engage with all of you as we move towards finalizing the progress declaration. I will now call on Gayatri Kant, representing the International Organization of Employers. Madam, you have the floor. But we don't hear you, so I think you need to unmute yourself. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm audible now? Okay, thank you. Dear co-facilitators and colleagues, thank you all for giving the IOE floor to provide the private sector perspective. I would like to raise few points today and send the other issues in writing to you. While we greatly appreciate and see the strengthening of the language under several paragraphs of the Zero Draft, we feel we are still lacking in some critical areas, and those I point out below, which would help and provide a solid basis for taking forward the GCM implementation. In paragraph 43, a commitment for member states to strengthen the efforts to ensure legal, regular, safe, predictable pathways of migration would be helpful, as smooth skills mobilities and to ensure smooth skills mobility and address the root causes of exploitation and abuse of migrants. Currently, there is no commitment on this in ensuring smooth in regular pathways. The same paragraph should address achieving these commitments not just by working with relevant multilateral fora, rather a commitment to work with multi-stakeholders, importantly with the private sector, to understand the labor market realities of skills, needs, and requirements. Paragraph 45 should commit to partnering with private sector in mutual recognition of formal and acquired skills and competencies of migrants, in understanding areas that need skilling and reskilling of migrants and their integration, as the private sector employers are best geared to provide this information. The global business community has taken a clear position against the charging of recruitment fees to job seekers and workers. This is expressed in many business-led initiatives, such as the World Employment Confederation's Code of Conduct, which clearly states that private employment services should not charge directly or indirectly, in whole or in part, any fees or cost to job seekers and workers for the services directly related to temporary assignment or permanent placement. Yet this commitment cannot, or the business community cannot achieve on its own. Governments should make clear their policy positions and include in national legislation a clear ban on charging recruitment fees and related costs, as defined by ILO. So long as national legislation allows these fees to be charged to job seekers, vulnerable migrant workers will risk being trapped by rogue intermediaries. So we would like to see a commitment from the member states in the text on this particular issue. Paragraph 46 has weakened the language by removing the commitment to reduce the average transaction cost of migrant remittances, while we see the direct impact of high costs on the migrants and loss of revenue for the poor families. Similarly, paragraph 48 does not commit to integrate migration as a cross-cutting issue, nor to the whole of government and whole of society approach. We reiterate the importance of these two approaches in the successful implementation of the GCM objective. The Progress Declaration would benefit from a strong commitment to engage with important stakeholders. Our proposed language is, we shall implement the whole of society approach by creating an institutional mechanism. I emphasize here on the on the phrase institutional mechanism to include all relevant stakeholders, that is the local governments, private sector, civil society organizations, and migrant communities, to bring their voice and expertise to the table. Such a process shall provide the necessary ecosystem with holistic migration policies and frameworks. We shall, in the same spirit, also ensure the approach of whole of government interacting with the whole of society for effective implementation of labor migration policies and frameworks at national, regional, and global levels. I hope these points can be taken into consideration and reflected in the draft going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Kant, for the suggestions of the IOE, and also thank you in advance for sending them in writing to the experts that are working now on the text. Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Mr. Christian Wolf, representing ACT Alliance and Climate and Migration Displacement Platform. Mr. Wolf, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for convening another virtual meeting with us on the Progress Declaration, and indeed for having worked very hard on its various improvements. Echoing some of what earlier speakers have said, we would like to support a strong push for the Progress Declaration to reaffirm the GCM so as to really capture the commitment to build upon and move forward with the implementation of the Global Compact. In this regard, we would also like to see a return to stronger language on commitments and actions for the implementation of the GCM, headlining Section 3 that was previously found in Rev 1, meaning not just commitment to international cooperation on migration, which happens in a lot of fora, both within and outside the UN, but actually a commitment to working on implementing GCM itself. We've made specific language suggestions on the importance of regular pathways, including in the context of people affected by climate change. We welcome some of the improvements in the text in this regard, and also in general the strengthening of human rights focus of the declaration in line with the guiding principles of the GCM. Specifically, in paragraph 21, we welcome the acknowledgement that the flexibility and availability of pathways has so far remained limited, and we think it's very important to retain this in order to drive more action in this area. Regarding Section 3 on the commitments and actions, we welcome many of the details that have been added here, including on eliminating adverse drivers of migration in paragraph 42 ter. For the sake of policy coherence across international frameworks, we think that the Paris Agreement, the Sendai Framework, and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda should all be mentioned here as well, since they provide important related tools for addressing adverse drivers, and states should coordinate their policy actions to maximize impact. In the service of policy coherence as well, we would also like to see this linked with paragraph 23 earlier, where there used to be a reference to climate finance, which we think should be restored, alongside a commitment to also address losses and damages resulting from the adverse effects of climate change. On the key paragraphs addressing commitments on pathways, which is paragraph 43 and its various additions, we really appreciate the additional work that's gone into this here, and we strongly recommend holding on to the new language that's been added. We would like to see a qualification in paragraph 43 on labor mobility agreements, noting that these should be rights-based and gender responsive. In addition, specific mention should be made in the enumeration of tools here of also providing admission and stay based on compassionate, humanitarian, human rights, or other considerations, in line with the language of the GCM and following guidance which has been elaborated on this topic by the UN Network on Migration's working group on regular pathways. We strongly support the mention in paragraph 43 bis on the need to avoid criminalization of migrants who've become victims of trafficking. Similarly, we feel it would be important in this context to also condemn the criminalization of humanitarian assistance to migrants, which is having an adverse impact on their lives and access to rights the world over. Finally, in paragraph 43 quad regarding returns, we welcome the mention of the prohibition of collective expulsions, but believe that this will be made stronger by adding that returns should be voluntary and respect due process in all circumstances. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wolf, for your suggestions to further improve the language. I will now call on Yubrai Nepal, Center for Migration and International Relations.
Thank you, Ambassador. This is Yuvraj from Center for Migration and International Relations, CMR from Nepal. So my suggestion is on paragraph 21, that is about irregular migration. So my suggestion is to add the following in paragraph 21, first sentence. We call on member states to extend conversation regarding a global moratorium without unity. We strongly feel about it because the children of migrant workers are living without their due rights for equal health and education. So we ask upon global moratorium for the undocumented migrant workers. So that's the only suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yubrai, for your contribution to the discussion. I will now call on Mr. John Bingham, representing the NGO Committee on Migration. Mr. Bingham, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you and Ambassador Rabab for the work on these drafts. Your teams, the town halls have all been inclusive. I think in the finest tradition and results of the SDGs, the New York Declaration, the Global Compact. So bravo, vraiment. The NGO Committee on Migration supports the positions of some 9 or 10 other NGO colleagues in the Action Committee that has worked so hard on all of those processes I mentioned, as well as this IMRF and regionally and internationally. In particular, we support the suggestions of our labor colleagues, Apollinaire and Carol Barton. Chanda spoke earlier of perhaps adding a new section, small paragraph 39 ter, on labor, centrality of labor in our societies, in our economies, in migration and the SDGs, as well as the Global Compact. The reason a 39 ter is needed is to balance and take forward the language that's solid in the introductory section, but into the recommendations. It seems missing there. It seems just a little bit perhaps a bit out of balance, if I may say it that way. But I want to commend the language of this revised draft. And urge you to hold a line on language that's very solid in there. So instead of just recommending new language, to hold the line in ways that our colleague Stefan Jacquemet a moment ago mentioned, many of the member states seem to support, and our colleague from the Quakers suggested maybe only a minority oppose. So to hold the line in paragraphs 38 and 39 bis, which talk about meaningful participation of migrants in these processes. In civil society, we can hardly think of anything more important than that in all of these processes, and more established, including in the Global Compact, where the 10th of the principles talks about including migrants, among others, in migration governance. So it's there already. We have to hold the line there. Paragraph 43, very much as Stefan Jacquemet said, we can't back down on regular pathways as a good that's been agreed in and of itself in the SDGs as well as in the Global Compact. There's not language of national priorities there, so we don't want to see that back down. Again, in paragraph 43 on regularizing, to stay faithful to the Global Compact on Migration, section 7I, which talks about building on existing practices to facilitate access to migrants in an irregular status to regular status. It's crystal clear there. And we know there's been quite some pushback by a small number of states, but if you could hold the line. And finally, to hold the line on section 55, especially the language complying with international obligations at borders and along migratory routes. So important. Other colleagues have mentioned it. If we can hold the line there. And to close, we were a little surprised at the suggestion from UNHCR to now open into a new paragraph that makes the distinction between refugees and migrants, given how difficult that always is. In negotiations, we all know the history there. And given the difficulty of maintaining the integrity of the full range of protection of all migrants under international human rights treaties that are enforceable and binding, as well as the Refugee Convention, it hardly seems the time to go down that road. However, and to finish entirely, if that is a road yet to travel in this negotiation, the NGO Committee on Migration would strongly recommend a reference in a few words to the importance of looking at the two compacts together, and not just how they're complementary, but how they interact for the full range of protection. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bingham, for your points and also for recognizing the efforts that has been made to further improve the progress declaration. Thank you very much. I will now call on Bijaya Kumari Shrestha, joining us from Nepal, if I have the right information. You have the floor. Bijaya Kumari Rai Shrestha, you have the floor. I see your hand is up. Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you, Your Excellency. Good afternoon. I represent an organization of returnee women migrant workers called AMCAS Nepal, which we are also with the Women in Migration Network. Thank you, Your Excellency, for this opportunity. As a returnee migrant worker myself, I would like to make my intervention, especially on the paragraph 30, 41, 42, and 43, to strengthen my points. Though earlier speakers have somewhat touched upon these paragraphs, I would like to say that we understand the specific vulnerabilities of women and children migrants. We call for the separation of the groups women and children wherever they have been mentioned together in the document. In particular, points 30, 41, and 42, as clubbing of these two groups together leads to the infantilization of women. The document should recognize women as independent migrant group constituting of their agency, needs, and migration flows. Infantilization of women migrants has often resulted in discriminatory policies against their migration flows. My second intervention will be in paragraph 43, where we also, there are a lot of interventions already, but still I would like to strengthen this, where we call for the formulation of the phrase violence to violence and harassment to align with the recently adopted ILO Convention 190, which takes a broader definition, scope, and coverage of violence and harassment, particularly in the world of work. Thank you, Your Excellency.
Thank you very much, Madam, for these very focused comments on 4 paragraphs. We have taken good note of those. I now call on Regimon Kutapon, a journalist who has the floor now. Mr. Kutapan, you have the floor. We can't hear you, so if you can unmute yourself, thank you very much.
I'm connecting from Sumita's computer, sorry.
Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Excellency. I'm Rajimon Kutappan from India. I'm an independent journalist reporting mainly on migration and migrant rights researcher, closely working with Migrant Forum in Asia based in Philippines and Center for Indian Migration Studies in India. My suggestion is on the inclusion of waste theft in paragraph 9, and I appreciate the IMRF down from my heart for including waste theft in 0 draft and 2 versions. I trust that the waste theft will not be dropped in the final progress declaration. Excellency, the waste theft was there before COVID too, but the pandemic has aggravated that and it is more visible now. By closely working with the MFA, who are campaigning on justice for waste theft since 2020 June, I have learned that from them that millions were and are stolen from migrant workers, especially from the low-paid ones, by employers citing COVID-19 induced loss as an excuse. And I have also reported a couple of wage theft stories where how migrants were forced to give up even 20 years of end of service and many months of salary when the hurried repatriation happened during the COVID outbreak. Excellency, the World Bank finds that wage theft is one of the reasons behind the dip in inward remittances for the countries of origin. Excellency, you know that.
Sorry, we don't hear you now.
That won't be dropped. Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you again.
Yeah.
Thank you. I could not hear the last sentence yet that you said, but if I can, I mean, we noted your point you made about wage theft, which is indeed now included in the progress declaration. Thank you very much for your contribution. I will, and if there are further elements, you can of course send them in writing to the email addresses that have been shared in the chat with all participants. Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Mr. William Goyce for the next intervention representing Migrant Forum Asia. Mr. Goyce, you have the floor. Mr. Goyce doesn't seem to be.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador. Just to say that we appreciate the mention of wage theft in the document. This is just to also just confirm what Regiman has just said. On behalf of trade unions and civil society across 3 regions that launched this campaign, Asia, Middle East, and Africa. This campaign has gained momentum, but we continue to document till today. Till today, we continue to document the fallout of the pandemic, where millions of migrant workers have not been given their wages or end of service benefits. There is a need to gather this data. There is a need. It is impossible for civil society alone or trade unions alone to gather this data on the loss and the damage that this has done to migrants and members of their families. So we request that the wage theft that is mentioned in the document be maintained. Like John said, I would use his words, hold the line. But at the same time, we request that within the capacity building fund, a window be opened for that will establish some compensation funds for migrant workers. On the other hand, in terms of access to justice, I support our colleagues who have called for an affordable, accessible, expedited, and efficient justice mechanism for migrant workers. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Mr. Goyce, for your comments and suggestions. We have taken note of those. Thank you very much. I now call on Mr. Hans van Loon. So you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you for giving me the floor. I'm representing the Institut du Droit International, which is the global organization of international lawyers, both public and private international lawyers. And I'm also the former Secretary General of the Hague Conference on Private International Law, which, as you may know, has produced a number of global conventions on various aspects of migration, such as marriage, divorce, also child protection and access to justice. The Institute was invited only recently to take part in this process, so only following our last meeting, I was able to send in a proposal to go a little beyond the current very useful process, which, however, remains a soft law approach. And the idea is to give a little bit of a beginning to something like to teeth to the proposal. Otherwise, people will say, "Where's the beef?" I sent in a proposal. It's not yet reflected in the draft. To the proposal to add a paragraph 56A, as follows. We request the Secretary General of the United Nations to examine the possibility of preparing a global conference to negotiate a global legal framework instrument to facilitate the procedural and administrative aspects of cooperation regarding temporary labor migration movements. This is a suggestion that follows up on a resolution which the Institute adopted at its conference in Hyderabad in 2017 to negotiate a basic legal instrument of a universal character governing direct cooperation between states of origin and host states of mass migration flows, including temporary migration flows. In the attachment to the proposal, we set out the idea in a little more detail. It's important to note that it focused exclusively on temporary, including circular, repetitive migration, and that it is strictly limited to facilitating the cooperative, the administrative aspects, leaving it entirely to host states and states of origin to fill in the details regarding the criteria for admission, entry, duration of the temporary schemes, the working conditions, and so on. The idea is just to give a little beginning of protection. If you think of what has happened, for instance, to the workers from Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, the Philippines, working in Qatar, working on the infrastructure of the football games. And you've seen the reports that at least 6,500 people have died there. It's immediately obvious that international law is deficient and that something must happen without going too much into the details that need to remain within the sovereignty of the host state and the state of origin. But there are certain minimum procedural things that the two states must respect in any case. So the idea is that while the compact is extremely useful and the IMRF process should continue, a next small step is needed beyond the current soft law approach. A practical global framework for cooperation between states of origin and host states focused on temporary migration would be a first step. It could be extended to education, temporary education agreements, but temporary labor protection seems to be the most urgent aspect to take into account. So with due respect, that would be our contribution to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Van Loon, for sharing this suggestion of the Institut du Droit International. And as you said, this is indeed something that goes beyond the remit of the GCM, which is, as you mentioned, non-legally binding. But thank you very much for sharing this suggestion with us. I will now call, I believe we have 4 more speakers before we wrap up. And I thank in advance the next speakers for keeping within the time so that we can hear everybody before we conclude this town hall meeting. I now call on Laxman Basnet, representing the South Asia Regional Trade Union Council.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. I will directly go to the text. The Progress Declaration is missing a fundamental element, respect to workers. To ensure decent work and respect on the job, migrant workers must be afforded the right to form, join, and participate in a union. How can workers guarantee their fundamental rights if they do not have a platform to stand together and demand it collectively? Freedom of association enables workers to work together to shift power dynamics. This is the only way that workers will have the agency to challenge inherently unequal and exploitative system. The Progress Declaration must include an explicit reference to the freedom of association in paragraph 9b. Proposed addition to the paragraph 9b is upholding international labor standards, including freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Mr. Basnet, for this suggestion focusing on labor, on workers' rights. I will now call on Mr. Victor Genina, representing Scalibrini International. Mr. Genina, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And just to be very brief, I go directly to the proposals. First of all, as I put in the box chat, we oppose those who want to make a distinction between regular and irregular migrants. We call to keep the language, the inclusive language, that access to services and the protection of human rights has to be done to all migrants, regardless migration status. Secondly, in paragraph 43 there, we propose to add at the beginning of the paragraph the following words: while not criminalizing or punishing people or organizations who provide humanitarian assistance to migrants, we commit and the rest. It's very important to avoid criminalizing personal individuals or organizations that provide assistance to migrants who are smuggled or trafficked. And this is not reflected in the text as it is now. And thirdly and lastly, we call for to maintain the title of the third section of the draft declaration, or if it's changed, the word commitment or commitments to be kept. That is key in order to have a declaration that is going to be a step forward in relation to the Global Compact, and it would be key to make it a useful and a practical document to be used in the ground by organizations. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Mr. Genina, for your suggestions focused on the text. Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Alexis Bautista, representing Migrant Women Forum. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you, co-facilitator and ambassador. As Migrant Women Forum, we'd like to highlight the following. First, we commend the co-facilitators and its team for considering and including people with disability, particularly in paragraph 37 and 39. It is imperative that all people are recognized, but perhaps beyond data collection and the context of COVID-19 pandemic. We have observed that children in the context of migration has been expounded and elaborated, but we humbly ask that their challenges and issues be made distinct from that of women. In line with the first 2 points, we hope to see a strengthened section on access to services for migrants with different social identities, including but not limited to women, children, persons with disabilities, and the LGBT community. Aside from the integration, reintegration, especially of women, should be strengthened in the document. We would also like to acknowledge the inclusion of wage theft in the Progress Declaration, which we think is vital as it encompasses the different issues and challenges faced by migrant workers. We hope to keep it as such and not be omitted. We appreciate the inclusion of upholding the right to freedom of expression in the Progress Declaration. However, we hope for it to be seen more in the document as this right is first and foremost one of the fundamental freedoms, particularly freedom from fear. We would also like to appeal our previous intervention on explicitly mentioning the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as it is the key international instrument that we think should be adhered to. Member states are the duty bearers who must be held accountable to its rights holders. We'd also like to appeal our previous intervention, including the migrants with diverse sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, and sex characteristics, or SOGSC. Gender is a wide spectrum, and we hope that women and the LGBT community's context could be brought to light in the Progress Declaration, particularly on the principle of non-discrimination. We also agree with the inclusion of ILO Convention 190 on eliminating violence and harassment in the world of work, And we would also like to emphasize the need to retain climate change as one of the drivers of migration, especially to island states. Lastly, we also echo the interventions made by others, particularly on labor migration, regularization, regular pathways, and reintegration. Thank you. We will send our comments in writing for consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Bautista, for your comments focused on the rights of women, people with disabilities, and also the LGBTI community. And thank you for sharing those also in writing. I now give the floor to Mr. Timo Schmidt, representing the Platform for Disaster Displacement. Mr. Schmidt, you have the floor.
Thank you, co-facilitator and ambassador, and congratulations to you, first of all, and the whole team in driving this process on the Progress Declaration forward. Several comments, but I'll limit myself to 3, echoing some colleagues, and mainly with the aim to highlight the importance to strengthen alignment with existing GSIM language in a few places, so we do not regress from that text. First, on paragraph 21, we really appreciate the inclusion of the sentence recognizing that the availability and flexibility of pathways for regular migration remains limited. And we of course hope that this will remain and there will be no regression on that. Of course, this holds true in particular in the context of climate change, disasters, and environmental degradation, which is why we would encourage similar language being included in paragraph 23, and we're happy to submit specific language on that. Also in paragraph 23, here it is noted that efforts to mitigate and adapt to the adverse effects of climate change have been insufficient, as acknowledged by COP and the Glasgow Climate Impact. In the same vein, we would also suggest recognizing the latest climate science here, and for the purpose of policy coherence, suggest adding a reference here to the IPCC 6th assessment report and the 3 working groups that have all recognized that global warming has and will indeed impact human mobility and migration. And then a final comment on paragraph 43, we welcome the slightly stronger language and the commitment in that paragraph, which talks about enhancing and diversifying pathways. But would point out that one dimension that's still missing is on solutions. And we had previously included a suggestion in line with Objective 21H of the GCM that says to urge states to strengthen cooperation to identify, develop, and scale up solutions for persons compelled to leave their countries of origin owing to disasters, the adverse effects of climate change, and environmental degradation. So with that, thanks very much, and we'll follow up with a few more points in writing. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schmidt, for PDD's suggestions to the Progress Declaration. And I'll now give the floor to the last speaker, last but not least, of course, Mr. Jack Amick, representing the United Methodist Church. So you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. I'm Reverend Jack Amick. I'm the Director of Global Migration at UMCOR, the United Methodist Committee on Relief. I just want to say that the Progress Declaration and the GMC, of course, all center around how migrants can be welcomed in a safe, orderly, and regular fashion. And yet, there's no mention in the document about welcome or welcoming. And I just find that ironic. I hope that we can slip the word welcome or welcoming into this document to remind us what this is all about. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Reverend Amick, for this suggestion that I believe you also made in our previous discussion to underline the welcoming of migrants. Dear colleagues, I see another hand raised, Mr. Binod Kadria. This would then really be our last speaker because we have to wrap up now.
Thank you, ambassadors, for accommodating me. I'll be extremely brief. I have been listening to the suggestions consolidating the draft agreement, the draft declaration. Yes, it has been becoming stronger and stronger, and I still notice that there have been many voices which trying to point out the fact that migrants, all categories of migrants, are not included, like people with disability and so on, for example. And in my last suggestion, I had mentioned that perhaps along with whole of society and whole of government, there should perhaps be the whole of migrants or all of migrants should be included, so that by default, we don't leave out any of the migrant categories. I had made other suggestions like having a preamble where we could have generic terminologies like waste theft or whole of migrants, whole of society, whole of government. And I leave it to you whether that is possible to be created under the mandate that Ambassador Fatima had mentioned as a constraint. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kadria, for your contribution and suggestions. I believe the terminology disability responsive has also now found its way in the progress declaration. Just to remark on the inclusivity of the language. Dear colleagues, we have now heard the last speaker in today's town hall meeting. On behalf of Ambassador Fatima and myself, I would really like to thank everyone present today and those who spoke for your constructive engagement and for the insightful comments you have made on the revision 2 of the IMRF progress declaration. I also express our appreciation to the colleagues from the UN Network on Migration for all their support in facilitating this discussion with all stakeholders, the sound technician, Ben, Monami Maulik for very ably supporting the moderation today. And last but not least, I would also like to thank the interpreters who ensured that the conversation was understood in the official UN languages. Thank you very much. As Ambassador Fatima and I have stressed in previous meetings, the success of this first progress declaration will very much depend on our shared commitment and engagement, member states and all relevant stakeholders. We greatly appreciate your efforts and to this end and wish to thank you again for your support. We will now enter the next round of our negotiations and we hope that we can count on your continued constructive engagement as we work to finalize this first progress declaration. Thank you again, everybody, for being here and for your continued engagement. And again, a reminder just to share your contributions, if you have not yet done so, in writing with our experts working on the progress declaration. Thank you very much, and I wish you a good rest of the day and a good end of the day for those in other parts of the world. And with this, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much. Stay safe, everybody. Thank you.